The year was 1942. The world was engulfed in war. And within the barbed wire fences of the Dachau concentration camp, a new kind of horror was taking root. It was a horror cloaked in the language of science, born from the ambition of one man. Dr. Sigmund Rascher was a physician, a man who had sworn an oath to do no harm. Yet he answered to a higher, more sinister authority. His ambition was not to heal, but to serve the Nazi war machine. He sought prestige within the SS, and he knew that groundbreaking research, no matter how depraved, was his path to power. He saw human beings not as patients, but as raw material for his experiments. Rascher's path was paved by the highest echelons of the Third Reich. He had a direct line to Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer of the SS. Himmler was obsessed with racial purity and soldier invincibility. When German pilots were shot down over the frigid North Sea, their survival rates were alarmingly low. Himmler wanted answers. How long could a German airman survive in freezing water? What was the most effective way to save them? He saw Dachau prisoners as a resource, their lives expendable for the greater good of the Reich. The experiments began with a chilling simplicity. A large wooden vat was set up in the medical block. It was filled with water. Ice was added, block by block. The temperature plunged to near freezing, typically between 2.5 and 12 degrees Celsius. The victims were chosen at random from the camp barracks. They were often Roma, Polish resistance fighters, Russian prisoners of war. They were stripped naked, their bodies already weakened by starvation and forced labor. They had no idea what was about to happen. They were simply test subjects, their humanity erased, their fate sealed by a doctor's decree. The air in the room was cold, thick with disinfectant and fear. Once the frigid water was ready, the prisoner was forced into the vat, sometimes clothed in an aviator's uniform, other times completely naked. Electrodes were attached, wires running to medical instruments. Devices recorded every change, every shudder, every faltering heartbeat. Dr. Rascher and his assistants stood by, clipboards in hand. They were not doctors trying to save a life. They were researchers collecting data. The tension in the experimental room was a palpable, silent thing. It was the tension of methodical observation. Every stage of the victim's decline was noted with unnerving detail. The Nuremberg trial transcripts later revealed the chillingly systematic nature of the process. As the prisoner was immersed, the first reactions were recorded. Intense, uncontrollable shivering, and a sharp, painful intake of breath. The doctors would speak to the victim, noting the point at which their speech became slurred and incoherent. They were not offering comfort. They were testing cognitive function as the brain was starved of warmth and oxygen. Every response, or lack thereof, was written down. The rectal thermometer, a long probe inserted deep into the body, provided a continuous reading of the core temperature. Rascher and his team watched the numbers fall. 37 degrees Celsius, 35 degrees, 32 degrees. They noted the external physical changes that corresponded with each drop. The skin turned blue, a condition known as cyanosis. Goosebumps covered the body. The shivering would eventually become more violent. Then, as the muscles exhausted their energy, it would cease altogether. This cessation of shivering was a critical data point, an indicator that the body was losing its final battle to generate heat. They timed how long it took for the victim to lose consciousness, which typically occurred when the body temperature dropped below 30 degrees Celsius. The experiments did not always end with death in the ice water. For some, a new phase of torture began, rewarming. Dr. Rascher needed to determine the most effective method for reviving a severely hypothermic person. This led to a series of new, equally barbaric tests. Once a prisoner was rendered unconscious and near death from the cold, their body temperature hovered around 29 to 30 degrees Celsius. They were removed from the vat. They were then subjected to different rewarming techniques. The selection of victims for these tests was as arbitrary and cruel as the initial immersion. It was simply a matter of who was available, who was deemed suitable for the next stage of the experiment. One primary method tested was rapid rewarming in hot water. The unconscious victim would be plunged into a bath of scalding water. The sudden shock to the system was immense. Doctors monitored the body's response, watching for the heart to restart and consciousness to return. Rascher noted cases of rewarming shock, catastrophic circulatory failure that was often fatal. The method meant to save life could end it. The deaths were recorded as data. Another method was animal warmth. 4 Roma women were brought from Ravensbrück. A hypothermic victim was placed between 2 naked women, forced to warm him with their bodies. The climax of the hypothermia experiments was the moment of death itself. Medically, what happened to the prisoners' bodies was a catastrophic cascading failure. As the core temperature dropped, the body's vital systems began to shut down. Peripheral blood vessels constricting, trying to keep warm blood near vital organs. Skin turned pale blue. The heart, struggling to pump thick, sludgy blood, was put under immense strain. The electrical impulses went erratic, atrial fibrillation. As the body cooled below 30 degrees Celsius, the brain was profoundly affected. The lack of warm, oxygenated blood led to confusion, disorientation, and ultimately the loss of consciousness. The prisoners would fall silent, their bodies limp in the icy water. After the war, the full extent of the horror at Dachau was brought into the light. The Nuremberg trials served as the world's stage for judgment. During the doctor's trial, the meticulous records kept by Sigmund Rascher and his assistants became the primary evidence against them. Rascher himself was not in the dock. He had been executed by the SS in the final days of the war, reportedly on Himmler's orders for unrelated deceptions. But his work was dissected in excruciating detail. Prosecutors presented his reports, his letters to Himmler, the sworn testimony of survivors, the sworn testimony of former camp personnel. The evidence was undeniable. The logs detailing body temperatures, survival times, the methods of rewarming exposed the cold, calculated nature of the atrocities. The court heard how prisoners were treated not as human beings, but as biological specimens. Surviving assistants testified to the procedures, describing the screams of the victims, the clinical detachment of the doctors. The trial resulted in convictions, death sentences for many of the doctors involved, establishing a new precedent for crimes against humanity. The findings from Dachau, however, created a profound and lasting ethical dilemma for the medical community. The data, though obtained through monstrous means, was in some cases the only human data of its kind. Most modern medical journals refuse to cite the Dachau experiments, viewing the data as fundamentally corrupted by the methods used to acquire it.